So let's talk about what really happens after a big collapse in your life or your career. We tell ourselves this story of failure and then this heroic rebuilding. But what if there's a more accurate and honestly a more helpful way to understand the whole thing? Let's dig into the structural view. I mean, a job loss, the end of a relationship, a crisis of faith. We've all been there, right? It's that feeling when the ground just gives way beneath you and you're left standing in the rubble with no idea what comes next. We tend to frame this experience as some kind of heroic journey. You know the one. You start in a bad place, the rubble of your old life, and through sheer force of will, you build your way up a mountain to some better, brighter future. It's a story that is completely focused on the outcome. But what if focusing on that trophy at the finish line is making us miss the point entirely? What if the real story is in the machine itself, in the process? We're going to shift our focus away from the end result and look at the fascinating structural process that's actually going on underneath it all. Okay, let's dive into this new framework. Instead of talking about rebuilding, we're going to use a different term, reorganization. And trust me, it's a powerful concept that kind of changes everything. So what is it? Well, from a structural point of view, reorganization is simply the system, and that's you, your career, your family, whatever it is, forming a new internal architecture after the old one just couldn't hold up anymore. Notice, this isn't about personal willpower, it's a mechanical process. And this is where the framework gets really, really powerful. It helps us reframe all of our judgmental language. We can stop talking about improvement or regression, and instead we can use these neutral structural terms. You're not growing, you're adapting. You're not improving, you're settling into a new configuration that just works. It's not about better or worse, it's about fit. And here's the crucial point. The goal is not getting better in some vague, abstract way. The system is simply trying to find a setup that can handle its current demands with less internal friction. The source material actually calls this friction coherence cost. So the whole process is really just a search for efficiency. Now, if you've ever been through this, you know it feels like anything but efficient. It feels chaotic, messy, and totally unpredictable. So let's look at why that is, because yep, there's a structural reason for all that mess. You see, a collapse can happen in an instant, but reorganization, that's a slow process. Think of it like this. The earthquake is fast, but rebuilding the city takes a long, long time. Right after a collapse, your internal map, your topology, is unstable. The usual roads are just gone. The familiar pathways for how you think and act are just temporary. The whole system is incredibly fragile. This reframing is so helpful because it shows how we misinterpret the signs. What feels like confusion? Well, that's actually the system testing out new pathways. What looks like weakness or giving up? That's just the system being pulled back toward old, familiar patterns, what complexity theory calls attractors. Because, hey, they're efficient and they require less energy. And what we call failure, that's simply the system realizing that a particular setup just isn't sustainable. I really want to pause on this quote because it's so important. When you find yourself slipping back into old habits, it is not a moral failing. It's your system, under a ton of stress, seeking a familiar, low-cost, predictable state. It's a move toward efficiency. So you might be wondering, if it's all so unstable and we keep snapping back to the old ways, how does a new, stable structure ever actually emerge? How does the system finally settle down? This is absolutely crucial to understand. This process doesn't happen on a retreat or when you've put life on pause. Nope. It happens while you're still paying the bills, raising the kids, and meeting deadlines. The new structure has to work in the real world, under the constant pressure of your actual life. So this system finally settles when three things happen. First, that internal conflict we talked about, the coherence cost, it drops significantly. Second, the sheer effort needed just to hold things together, that stabilization, it starts to relax. And third, and this is the most important part, this new setup actually works when life tests. And here's the payoff. The new way of being that emerges isn't the right answer. It's not your true self being discovered. It's not optimal or ideal. It is simply a configuration that fits your current reality. It's what works, right here, right now. Okay, let's wrap this all up by looking at the real power this perspective gives us. Because what it does is take all the judgment, all the stories of success and failure, right out of the equation. You know that moment when things finally click? When you feel that huge wave of relief? From a structural view, that's not the feeling of winning. It's the physical sensation of your internal architecture no longer fighting itself. It's the feeling of that coherence cost finally going down. So here's the ultimate takeaway, the big reframe. The old story tells us that collapse is failure and rebuilding is success. But the structural story, it says collapse is simply a transition, and reorganization is the necessary process of finding a new, coherent way to operate under pressure. I'll leave you with this final thought. By seeing these messy, unstable periods not as a problem that needs to be fixed, but as a fundamental structural process at work, we can change our entire relationship to them. What if all that chaos is just the sound of a new, more workable structure being born?